The restaurant went quiet. The way a room goes quiet when something is about to break, and it broke the moment Constable Russell Hatcher's hand came down hard on the shoulder of a woman who hadn't done a single thing wrong. Stand up. Hands where I can see them. He'd picked her because she looked, to him, like the easiest person in the room to push. He expected a flinch. He expected her to fold the way frightened people fold, to start apologizing for crimes she'd never committed just to make the uniform go away. What Constable Hatcher did not know, could not have known, because he never once stopped to look at anyone as a full human being before he decided what they were, was that the silver-haired man stepping back in from the lobby, the one slipping his phone into his breast pocket, had spent 40 years learning exactly what to do with men like him. And by the end of that night, Russell Hatcher would understand that there is a kind of authority that never needs to raise its voice, and a kind of justice that takes its time but always, always arrives. But that comes later. Start at the beginning, the way these things actually begin, quietly, on an ordinary cold evening, with no warning at all. It was the second week of November in Ottawa, and the wind coming off the canal had that early winter bite that makes people walk faster and talk less. Inside Verlaine, on a side street just off the Byward Market, none of that weather reached the tables. The place was all warm brass and low amber light, white linen, the soft clink of good cutlery, the kind of restaurant where the wine list had its own leather binding, and nobody ever told you the prices out loud. Cabinet ministers ate there, deputy ministers, defense contractors, the occasional visiting general. The quiet money and the quiet power of the capital folded into corner booths where deals got made over $40 plates of duck. At a table near the back sat Lieutenant Colonel Yara Adebayo Vance, and to anyone glancing over, she looked like she belonged there as much as the chandeliers did. 44 years old, in a charcoal suit cut close and clean, she had the kind of stillness that most people mistake for calm. It wasn't calm, exactly. It was the stillness of someone whose body has learned, over a very long time, never to waste a movement. Because in the places she'd worked, a wasted movement could be the last one you made. Her hands rested easy on either side of a glass of sparkling water, and across the backs of them ran a few faint silver lines. Old scars she never explained, and nobody ever asked about. She didn't look like a soldier, and that was rather the point. For 13 years, Adebayo Vance had done work the country would never read about in the paper. She had gone into rooms other people were running out of. She had carried men down mountains and pulled them out of rivers and stood in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that were never officially done. The uniform she'd worn on those jobs had no name tape and no flag anyone was supposed to recognize. She was, in the plainest terms, one of the most decorated members of Joint Task Force 2 still serving. And, in 3 weeks' time, at Rideau Hall, the Governor-General was going to pin the Star of Military Valor to her chest for an action in a valley she still couldn't talk about. Tonight wasn't the medal. Tonight was just dinner, a private celebration, 2 people and a good bottle. Before the formality of the ceremony swallowed it all up, she was waiting on the second of those 2 people. Lieutenant General Conrad Whitfield had excused himself 5 minutes earlier to take a call from National Defense Headquarters. The sort of call a man at his level can't let go to voicemail, and he'd stepped into the quieter alcove by the entrance with a muttered apology and the easy familiarity of a man who'd been her commanding officer, her mentor, and for the better part of 2 decades, the closest thing she had to a second father. Whitfield was a 4-star, general by appointment in everything but the final paperwork, and he had decided, somewhere back when Adebayo Vance was a green lieutenant who talked too fast and trusted too little, that this one was worth everything he could give her. He had been right. He usually was. He'd flown in from Ottawa proper just to share this meal, and he was not going to let the Pentagon's northern cousins ruin it with a phone call. He'd be back in 2 minutes, 3 blocks away. The mood inside Cruiser 1147 was nothing like the mood inside Verlaine. Constable Russell Hatcher had his jaw set, and his thumbs drumming a hard little rhythm on the wheel. 13 years on the Ottawa Police Service, and somewhere around year 4 that career had quietly stopped moving. There were reasons. There were always reasons, and in Hatcher's case, the reasons filled a folder thicker than most. A temper he called command presence, a habit of finding probable cause wherever he wanted it, and a long grey string of complaints that had a curious way of evaporating before they ever reached a hearing. He had friends in the association. He knew which sergeants would look the other way. He had learned the single most dangerous lesson a bad officer can learn, that nothing ever actually happens to you. And he had spent a decade acting on it. He was a man who wanted to be respected and had never once figured out that respect and fear are not the same thing. The radio crackled. Dispatch, flat and bored. Report of a theft from a jewelry boutique on Sussex. Several high-end watches taken. Suspect described only as a tall black male in dark clothing, largely on foot. That was all. It was the kind of description that described nothing. Half the men on a Friday night fit it, and any officer worth the badge would have treated it as a starting point, not a verdict. To Hatcher, it was permission. He pulled the cruiser out fast, nosed it down toward the market, and he wasn't thinking about watches. He was thinking about the way the evening had been grinding on his nerves, about the inspector who'd chewed him out that afternoon, about how good it would feel to walk into one of those soft little rooms, full of soft little people, and remind everyone who actually ran the street. He parked across the red zone outside Verlaine, killed the engine, checked his reflection in the dark glass of the door, and went in. The warmth hit him first, then the hush. The maitre, a slim, precise man named Bertrand, came forward with a professional smile already going thin at the edges. "Good evening, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" "Police business." Hatcher didn't slow down. "Stay out of my way." He moved into the dining room with his boots coming down harder than they needed to. That flat, tactical thud meant to be heard. And conversations stuttered and died around him as he passed. His eyes swept the tables, the grey suits, the pearl earrings, the men with good haircuts and better lawyers, and skated right over all of them because none of them were what he was hunting for. Then he found her. Corner table, dark suit. A woman, yes, but tall and black and alone, and that was enough. That was always enough for a man like Hatcher, who could take a description that fit 10,000 people and decide it fit exactly the one he'd already chosen. He didn't notice that she'd clocked him the second he came through the door. He didn't notice the small, exact way her eyes had tracked his reflection in the window glass, reading his shoulders, his hands, the white knuckle grip on his radio. He didn't notice, because men like Hatcher never think the quiet person is watching them. They think they're the only one in the room who sees anything at all. Adebayo, Vance set her glass down without a sound and laced her fingers together on the white cloth. She waited. "You." Hatcher's voice carried across the whole room, loud and ugly in all that hush. "I need to see some ID." She looked up, and her face gave him nothing. "Good evening, constable. May I ask why? You match the description of a suspect in an armed robbery, 3 minutes from here." It was a lie, and a deliberate one. The call had been a theft, no weapon mentioned, no violence. But Hatcher knew that the word robbery gave him room to be rough, and theft did not. Eddie, now. The couple at the next table had stopped eating. A fork hung in the air. Adebayo Vance leaned back a fraction against the leather, and when she spoke her voice was the most reasonable thing in the world. "Constable, I've been at this table for the better part of an hour. The host seated me. The server has been by 4 times. There's a half-finished plate in front of me. I haven't been near Sussex Drive tonight. So I'll ask you again, more directly, am I being detained?" It was the right question, and they both knew it. It is the precise question that pulls the floor out from under an officer fishing for compliance he hasn't earned. Under the Charter, a person who is not being detained is free to go, free to say nothing, free to keep eating their dinner. Hatcher's jaw worked. He hadn't expected the word charter in the woman's calm, level eyes. He'd expected fear, and what he was getting instead was law, and there is nothing a bully hates more than being corrected in public by someone he's decided is beneath him. "You're being difficult," he said, and stepped closer, his belt pressing the table edge so the cutlery jumped. "You think a nice suit means the law doesn't apply to you?" "I think a vague description of a tall black person in a city of 1 million people isn't reasonable grounds to detain anyone." Her tone never rose. If anything, it dropped, went flatter and cooler, the warmth draining out of it, the way warmth drains out of a voice that is used to giving orders that get followed. "But you're welcome to confirm my arrival time with the staff. The manager has it, the reservation has it. Or you can let me finish my meal." That was the moment Hatcher lost whatever thin grip he'd had on himself. He reached down and unclipped the cuffs from his belt, and that small metallic snap went off in the silent room like a slap. "On your feet, you're under arrest." She didn't move. Her hands stayed flat and visible on the linen, a deliberate thing, a trained thing, the posture of someone showing a room full of phones that she was no threat to anybody. On what charge? Obstruction, resisting. And if I have to pull you out of that booth, I'll add assault. He was leaning in now, close enough that she could smell the cold and the coffee on him. Get up. The dining room had gone past quiet into something heavier. Servers stood frozen with plates in their hands. By the host stand, Bertrand was already on the phone, his face the color of the tablecloths, and here and there, rising from the dark of the tables, the small blue glow of phone scene screens. 3 of them, 4 more, every one of them pointed at the corner booth, recording. Adebayo Vance looked up at Hatcher, and for the first time something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, pity. The kind you feel for a man walking off a cliff who still thinks he's on solid ground. I'd think very carefully about what you do next, Constable, she said softly. You're about to cross a line you won't be able to walk back. He laughed, short, mean. You have no idea who you're dealing with. She almost smiled. She did, actually, know exactly who she was dealing with. She'd met 100 Russell Hatchers in a dozen countries, but she didn't get the chance to tell him that, because his hand was already moving, reaching for the lapel of her jacket, fully meaning to haul her up and over and down onto the hardwood floor in front of 50 witnesses. His fingers never touched the fabric. A shadow came across the table, and with it, a presence so large and so absolute that the whole room seemed to tilt toward it. From directly behind Hatcher, a voice came down, low, gravelled, unhurried. A voice that had briefed prime ministers and stood in operations centres while the world held its breath. A voice that had never in living memory had to be raised to be obeyed. Take your hand off her, now. Hatcher spun, a furious word already forming, ready to arrest whoever in this room of soft people had dared. And he looked up, actually up, because the man was a full head tall, into a pair of pale grey eyes set in a weathered, mountain-still face. Lieutenant General Conrad Whitfield had come back from his call in time to see the cuffs come out. He'd stood in the archway and watched the whole thing, the way he'd once watched young soldiers under fire, measuring, waiting, deciding. Now he stepped in close, and on the lapel of his dark civilian suit, a small pin caught the light. Crossed swords beneath a maple leaf and a crown, and above them the unmistakable cluster that meant the man wearing it commanded armies. Hatcher might not have known the exact grammar of the insignia, but every cell in his body recognized what it meant. This was not a manager. This was not some indignant lawyer. This was a man before whom entire institutions stood up straight. The constable's furious word died in his throat. Whitfield did not step back. If anything, he came closer, until they were nearly chest to chest, and Hatcher had to crane his neck to hold the man's gaze. You have about 10 seconds, the general said, in a near whisper that carried to every silent corner of the room, to explain to me why you are putting your hands on one of the most decorated soldiers this country has ever produced. At her own celebration dinner, 3 weeks before her sovereign honors her for valor. Take your time, I'm a patient man. And there, in the long, terrible pause that followed, Russell Hatcher began, far too late, to understand exactly what kind of night he had walked into. The blood went out of his face. The cuffs, a moment ago so heavy with menace, hung off 2 fingers like something he'd forgotten he was holding. He looked from the general to the woman and back, and the whole aggressive architecture of his body, the squared shoulders, the spread feet, the puffed chest, came apart all at once, the way a tent comes apart when you pull the one stake holding it up. She matched a description, he managed, and his big voice had gone reedy. Sir, there was a robbery. I was conducting a lawful stop. You were conducting nothing of the kind. Whitfield's contempt was a quiet, surgical thing. I have been sitting at that table with this officer for the better part of an hour. We ordered the Pinot, the oysters, a rack of lamb that has not yet arrived. The staff will tell you. The reservation will tell you. The cameras over the host stand will tell you. So whatever we were doing, Constable, it was not police work. It was something a good deal smaller and uglier than that, and I think you know it. Hatcher took a half step back and bumped an empty chair. I was acting on dispatch. You were acting on the chance to feel large. The general said it almost gently, which made it worse. You looked across a room, saw someone you'd already decided didn't belong, and you went looking for a reason. You ignored her answer. You ignored the law she quoted you, which you should have known cold. And you were a breath away from laying hands on a citizen with no grounds at all. He let that sit. Do you have any idea how badly this evening is about to go for you? Adebayo. Vance moved then, unhurried, and took up her napkin. She wiped her mouth, set the cloth down square, and the very ease of it was more frightening somehow than the general's anger. She looked at Hatcher with the flat, assessing patience of someone sizing up an opponent who had already lost and didn't know it yet. Constable Hatcher, she read off his name tag, and her voice was almost kind. I asked you earlier whether I was being detained. You told me I was under arrest. You've now been told, in front of 50 witnesses and a dozen cameras, that the grounds you invented are factually impossible. So I'll ask one last time. Are you continuing with this arrest? He was caught, and he knew it. Back down now, and he was a coward on 100 phones by morning. Push forward, and he was arresting a war hero in front of a man who could end careers with a phone call. His fragile, frightened ego did the only thing it knew how to do. It doubled down. I'm calling for backup. His hand went, shaking, to the radio on his shoulder. Non-compliant subject. Interfering party. Whitfield let out a single low breath that might, in a kinder man, have been a laugh. Interfering party. He reached into his jacket, and for 1/2 second of pure animal panic, Hatcher's hand twitched toward his sidearm. But Adebayo Vance had shifted, just barely, the weight coming up off her hips, ready to come across that table like weather if a weapon cleared leather. And the constable read it in some old reptile part of his brain and went still. The general did not produce a weapon. He produced a phone. You want a supervisor, son? He thumbed a number from memory. Let's not waste time with a duty sergeant. He raised it to his ear, and in that dead silent room the people nearest could hear it ringing through. Desmond, it's Conrad Whitfield. I'm sorry to ruin your Friday. A pause. No, I'm fine. I'm at Verlaine, in the market, having dinner with Lieutenant Colonel Adebayo Vance. Yes, that dinner. The medal's in 3 weeks. Listen to me. One of your constables has just tried to drag her out of her chair on a description he made up. Hand on his sidearm, the works. Badge, says Hatcher. I want you here, personally. Russell Hatcher's stomach dropped straight through the floor of the world. Desmond Carrow, the chief of the Ottawa Police Service. The general had the chief on speed dial, and the chief had answered on the second ring. The hammer of consequence wasn't falling anymore. It was already in the air. It took Chief Carrow 11 minutes to arrive, and they were 11 of the longest minutes of Hatcher's life. He stood pinned by the table, unable to leave, unable to stay, while the wealthy and connected of the city watched him over their wine, and the phones kept recording, and the lamb that Whitfield had ordered, finally, absurdly, arrived, carried out by a server, who set it down with trembling hands and fled. Adebayo Vance leaned forward, forearms on the table, and her quietness changed key. Sharpened, focused, the way a still pond goes hard when the temperature drops. In my line of work, Constable, she said, conversational as anything, we call what you just did funneling yourself. You walked into a space you didn't understand, made a call on bad intelligence, and you put yourself somewhere with no read on the ground, no support and no way out. You didn't assess. You hunted. You hunted because you thought I was soft. She tilted her head, and her dark eyes held him still. The dispatch said, the man fled on foot, up the street. You found a woman sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door, eating dinner. You didn't see any of that, because you weren't looking for a suspect. You were looking for someone to make small. You picked wrong, and you picked the wrong night. He had nothing. There was nothing to have. Then the front doors opened on a gust of November, and Chief Desmond Carrow came through them in a tuxedo with the bow tie hanging loose around his collar. He'd been pulled out of a charity gala 3 streets over, and a half step behind him came Inspector Lorraine Doucet from Professional Standards, sharp and unsmiling in a dark coat, her eyes already crossing the room and landing on Hatcher like a verdict. 2 large duty officers flanked them. Carrow went straight past Hatcher, as though he were furniture, and put out his hand to the general. Conrad, I am so sorry. He turned to the woman at the table, and his voice dropped into something close to reverence. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you for your service to this country, and on behalf of my entire service, I am ashamed this happened in my city. Then slowly, the chief turned the way a ship turns its guns and looked at Constable Russell Hatcher. 11 years, Carrow said, and his voice was very low. 11 years of complaints I couldn't make stick because the people you did it to didn't have the money or the standing or the energy to fight us. I know about you, Hatcher. I have known about you for a long time, but you finally did it in front of 50 witnesses and a 4-star general, and the association is not going to save you tonight. Chief, I can explain. You'll have years to explain. Caro nodded to Inspector Doucet. She stepped forward and… This was the part the phones would replay 1,000,000 times. She didn't reach for handcuffs. She pulled a zip tie from her pocket, the kind they use when there's no courtesy left to extend. Constable Hatcher, Doucet said, flat as slate. As of this moment you are relieved of your authority. Surrender your firearm, your conducted energy weapon, your radio, and your badge. She let a beat fall. Turn around, hands behind your back. His hands shook so badly he could barely work the clasps. The duty belt came off and hit the floor with a heavy slap. The badge came off his chest last, and he had to be told twice before his fingers would obey. Then he turned, and the plastic tie zipped tight around his wrists, with a small sound exactly like the one his own cuffs had made a few minutes before. And there is a kind of justice in that symmetry that no writer could improve upon. You're being detained pending a full investigation, Doucet told him, into breach of the charter, unlawful arrest, and assault under colour of authority. You'll be processed at the station. Caro turned back to the table one last time. Please, finish your dinner. The evening's on the service, and I'll make sure of it personally. He glanced at the general. Conrad, I'll call you myself in the morning. And as Russell Hatcher was walked toward the door, stripped of his belt and his badge, and the borrowed importance he'd worn like a costume his whole life, the room sat silent for 3 full seconds. Then, from a table near the windows, an older woman in a grey shawl began slowly to clap. A man beside her joined. And then the whole of Verlaine, all that quiet money and quiet power, rose up into applause that followed the disgraced constable out the door and into the cold, and did not stop until the door had swung shut behind him. Adebayo Vance picked up her water, took a slow sip, and watched the back of his head until it was gone. Inspector Lorraine Doucet did not go home that night. She went to the records room instead, and by midnight she had Russell Hatcher's career spread out across a steel table like a body on a slab, and the autopsy told a depressingly familiar story. 11 complaints in 9 years, excessive force, unlawful detention, 3 separate allegations of profiling, each one of them filed by someone the system found easy to ignore. A teenager from Vanier with a prior. A new immigrant whose English failed her in the interview room. A man with an addiction who nobody believed about anything. Every single one of them had been someone without the means to fight, without the lawyer, without the standing. And against each one, the association had quietly closed ranks, and the complaints had been smoothed away into nothing. How? Doucet said softly to the empty room, turning a page. Did you last this long? But she knew how. He'd lasted because he'd always hunted in the right territory, among people the city had already decided not to listen to. His mistake, his single fatal mistake, was straying out of it. He'd put his hands on a woman with the entire weight of the Canadian Armed Forces behind her, in a room full of the people who actually got listened to, in front of a man who had the chief's personal number. The shield that had always protected him only worked in the shadows. Hatcher had stepped into the light, and the shield had turned to glass. There was a knock, and a detective sergeant named Ralph Beddoe leaned in, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Heard you caught the Hatcher file, he said. Thought you'd want this. We got our actual jewelry thief about 20 minutes ago. Found him 4 blocks north, in a stairwell, backpack full of stolen watches. Doucet looked up. Tell me. Beddoe almost smiled. Kid named Cody Ferris, 19, white about 5'8", wearing a grey hoodie and joggers, soaked through from running. The boutique owner's call was crystal clear, described a young white male in a hoodie from the start. He set a folder on the table. Doesn't look one thing like a 44-year-old woman in a tailored suit, Inspector. Not one thing. The cold satisfaction that went through Lorraine Doucet then was almost too clean to be real. So the description Hatcher claimed gave him grounds. Never matched, not at any point. We pulled the dispatch audio. The original call named the hoodie, the joggers, the whole thing. He didn't mishear it. Beddoe shook his head. He ignored it and went and found himself a target. Copy that audio, Doucet said. I want it on the chief's desk before he's had his coffee. Constable Hatcher spent his whole career using the law as a club. I'd like very much to show him what it feels like from the other end. The disciplinary hearing came 3 days later in a windowless room on the top floor of police headquarters, and the Russell Hatcher who sat at that table was not the man who'd thudded into Verlaine in his boots. He wore a cheap grey suit a size too big. His face had gone grey to match it. Beside him sat his association representative, a tired man named Gerald, who kept checking his watch and would not meet anyone's eye, because Gerald had read the file too, and Gerald already knew how this ended. Across from them, Chief Desmond Carrow, Inspector Lorraine Doucet, and a woman neither Hatcher nor his rep had been warned about. Crown Counsel Margaret Whitlock, who folded her hands and watched the constable the way you watch something you've already decided to step on. Carrow laid out the dispatch audio first, then the boutique owner's statement, then the arrest of Cody Ferris, and with each one the floor of Hatcher's defense dropped another foot. I made a mistake, the constable tried, somewhere in there. It was dark. I was confused. Don't, Doucet said, not loudly. You weren't confused. The call could not have been clearer. You didn't make a mistake, constable. You made a choice. You bypassed the staff, who could have cleared her in 30 seconds. You ignored her when she told you the law. You took out your handcuffs and you reached for a citizen who had done nothing in front of half the city. That's not confusion. That's character. Gerald cleared his throat. Chief, my client acknowledges a serious lapse. Given 13 years of service, the association would propose a lengthy suspension and retraining. Stop there. Carrow held up a hand, almost wearily. The association isn't running this one, Gerald, because it stopped being yours the moment it stopped being a discipline matter. He looked down the table. Crown Counsel Whitlock spoke for the first time, and her voice was cool and even and entirely without mercy. Mr. Hatcher, Lieutenant Colonel Adebayo Vance is a serving member of the Canadian Armed Forces. When you attempted to detain and lay hands on her without grounds, you didn't just breach service policy. You violated her rights under Section 9 of the Charter, arbitrary detention, and Section 15, equal protection without discrimination. You committed assault under the Criminal Code, and the pattern of your prior conduct, which Inspector Doucet has been good enough to assemble, goes directly to whether any of this was, as your representative would have it, a single bad night. Hatcher looked wildly at Gerald, and Gerald looked at the table, because the association protected men from internal slaps on the wrist. It did not go to war with the Crown. We've read your file, Mr. Hatcher, Whitlock went on. We found in it a documented pattern of using your badge to frighten people who couldn't fight back. You did it for years, because the people you chose lacked the means to make you answer for it, and you came to believe, quite sincerely I think, that you were the law. She leaned in a fraction. You are not the law. You're a man who was handed a uniform and mistook it for permission, and it ended the second you put your hand on the wrong shoulder. Carrow closed the binder with a sound like a door. Constable Russell Hatcher. Effective immediately, your employment with the Ottawa Police Service is terminated. You will be decertified. You will not wear this uniform or any other police uniform in this country ever again. Your pension is frozen pending the resolution of the civil and criminal proceedings against you. Hatcher made a small broken sound and put his face in his hands. And as of this morning, Whitlock added, gathering her papers and rising, the Crown has laid charges, assault and breach of trust by a public officer. There is a warrant. You'll be processed today. 2 officers stepped in from the hall. On your feet, Mr. Hatcher, one of them said, and Hatcher rose on legs that didn't want to hold him, and the cuffs closed around his wrists with that same small final sound, the third time, and the last, and they led him out of the room, and out of the only life he'd ever known how to live. 9 months later, in a courtroom in the Ottawa courthouse on Elgin Street, the doors closed on Russell Hatcher one final time, and there was nothing warm or amber about that room. It was all grey carpet and pale wood and the flat mechanical patience of a system that does not care how big you used to think you were. He sat at the defense table, a hollowed-out version of the man from the restaurant, the cheap suit hanging off a frame that grief and sleeplessness had thinned. His wife had filed in the spring, 3 months into the media storm, and gone home to her mother in Pembroke. The men he'd called brothers had lined up to condemn him on the record, eager to stand clear of the blast. He had nobody behind him. Across the aisle, in the front row of the gallery, sat Lieutenant Colonel Yara Adebayo Vance, and this time she was not in a charcoal suit. She was in her Canadian Forces dress uniform, the new badges of rank crisp at the collar, and on the left of her chest, above the rows of ribbon, sat a small 4-pointed star with a crown at its centre, the Star of Military Velour, which the Governor-General had pinned there at Rideau Hall 6 months before, and which commanded a respectful silence from every court officer in the room. Beside her, an unmoving pillar, sat Lieutenant General Conrad Whitfield. Madam Justice Eleanor Prentice took the bench. The room rose and settled. "Mr. Hatcher," she said, looking down over her glasses, "a jury has found you guilty on both counts. Before I pass sentence, is there anything you'd like to say?" He stood, gripping the table to stay upright, and turned to look back at the woman in the uniform, with his eyes wet and begging for a mercy he had never once, in 11 documented years, shown to anybody. "I'm sorry," he said. "I made a terrible mistake. I've lost my career, my marriage, everything. I'm asking the court for leniency." Justice Prentice did not soften. "Mr. Hatcher, you did not make a mistake. A mistake is an honest error. What you did was a deliberate abuse of the trust this country placed in you. You chose Lieutenant Colonel Adebayo Vance because of the color of her skin, and you assumed her silence was guaranteed by your badge. You believed you stood above the people you were sworn to protect." She leaned forward. "But you chose the wrong person, and in doing so, you did this city a service you never intended. Your conduct that night forced open a file that should have been opened years ago. Because of what you did, 11 officers with histories like yours have since left this service. The shield you hid behind is gone. You broke it yourself." A single tear ran down his grey cheek, and he did not wipe it. "The badge you wore is a sacred trust," the justice continued. "When you turn it into a weapon, you do not only harm the person in front of you, you injure the faith every citizen has the right to place in those who police them. This court will not pretend otherwise." She lifted her pen. "Russell Hatcher, on the charge of breach of trust and the charge of assault, it is the sentence of this court that you serve a term of 7 years in a federal institution, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are remanded into custody immediately." The officers moved in. The steel closed around his wrists for the last time, and Russell Hatcher was led out a side door into the dark of the cells. Bound for a federal prison where former police officers live in a careful, frightened isolation all their own, and he did not look back, because there was no one left who would look back at him. In the gallery, the general turned to the soldier beside him. There was no triumph in his face. There rarely is, in the faces of people who've actually carried things. "It's done, Colonel," he said quietly. "Adebayo." Vance nodded, her back straight. "Yes, sir, it is." They walked out together into a bright Ottawa morning, the maple leaves along Elgin gone golden red, the cameras and the shouted questions waiting at the bottom of the steps. She didn't stop for any of it. She had soldiers to get back to, and a country to keep serving, and she had never had any use for a spotlight. Justice had been done. Not only for her, but for the teenager from Vanier, and the woman whose English had failed her, and the man nobody believed, every voiceless person Russell Hatcher had ground under his boot in the long, dark years when he thought no one was counting. The scale had finally come level, and that is the whole of it, the way it actually happened, quietly at the start, and louder at the end, the way these things tend to go. A man decided that a badge gave him the right to make himself large by making someone else small, and he picked, out of every person in that room, the one he was most certain would fold. He could not have known that the calm woman with the scarred hands had stared down far worse than him on 3 continents, or that the man stepping back in from the lobby commanded armies. But that is the thing about cruelty dressed up as authority. It is always, always certain it has chosen the weak one. And it is so often, in the end, terribly wrong. True power never has to shout. And justice, however slow, however long, it lets the arrogant believe they've gotten away with it, never once forgets to balance the books. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever watched someone hide their cowardice behind a uniform, or wish to see the scale come level just once, then do something for the people who can't tell their own stories yet. Leave a comment below and tell us. Do you believe justice was truly served? Hit that like button so more people find their way to this channel. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the quiet ones are rarely the weak ones. And subscribe to Sounds of Justice so you never miss the next true-to-life reckoning. We'll see you in the next one.